Welcome again to African News Review, our weekly conversation in which we take a look at the coverage of Africa in the Western media and deconstruct the stories. This week, we are taking a different route. And to explain why the focus of this episode is not given in the history books, I speak to the person of Robert Sobukwe. But before we get into that, I have to do the usual. I'm your host, Adesoji Iginla. And with me, as usual, is here to share his wealth of knowledge and experience. Is a journalist, publisher, Black Star News on WBI.org, 99.5 FM New York Radio. His book, How Africa was demonized in the Western media, inspired this program. And I speak to no other person than the comrade Milton Allimadi. Welcome again, brother.
Asante Sana, thank you, my friend.
Yes. But before we go deeper, I also have to express an appreciation so far. We're almost there. We thought we had 1,000, but we are on 999 subscribers. I repeat,
Wow.
999 subscribers.
So you're going to have some blessings today. I think you should definitely recognize the number 1,000 should be a special guest in a future show.
Yes. I mean, again, even reaching that 999 is a milestone that we couldn't have possibly done without the number one up to 999. And
absolutely. In fact, the first subscriber should be a guest.
Yes. And it shows the trust, the understanding, the belief in what we are doing, because for long, the story about Africa has been framed around us. We have not had a seat at the table. So now this is our own retort to what is said about us. And once again, I show deepest appreciation to Brother Milton, who has been here, giving us, the scoop, as it were, and understanding that sometimes the story is not what they seem, given the historical background. So, which brings me now to today's topic, Robert Sobukwe. Who is Robert Sobukwe? Could you first of all introduce him to the audience? Who is Robert Sobukwe?
Okay. Robert Sobukwe, of course, he's best identified with being the main organizer of the protest march to denounce the passbooks system, which is the internal passport and ID that every Black person had to carry, every African had to carry in South Africa. And it basically had their basic information. But most important aspect was their labor status, because it was meant to document all available labor in South Africa. And that's why they were forced to carry that humiliating passbook that basically identified them and made them actually feel like non-human beings, like commodities, which exactly what they were. They were inputs into the production system, the economic system, seen merely as providers of labor and not as human beings. Widely detested, that passbook. So in South Africa, Robert Sobukwe, one of the prominent anti-apartheid leaders, a nationalist, a Pan-Africanist, who believed in a United States of Africa, by the way. So he organized that protest that resulted in the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960. Robert Sobukwe was advocating that the party leading the anti-apartheid struggle had to be a party of Africans. So he grouped the populations into groupings in South Africa. He said we had national groupings, but in essence, all of us are human beings. We don't recognize white, we don't recognize Black. We essentially recognize that we are part of the human family. And if that is the case, we cannot have a system of apartheid or even multi-racialism, since there's only essentially one race. And that's what he advocated. And of course, he was seen, unlike the other anti-apartheid leaders, including Nelson Mandela, he was seen with a bit much more fear by the establishment and by the people fighting the establishment, because this was a party that he said should be led by Africans. And if anybody wanted to identify with Africans and accepted an African majority, then they too would be welcome to that party as Africans. And that's what set him apart from the other anti-apartheid leaders. And I think that is also one of the main reasons why he was not embraced globally in the same manner in which Nelson Mandela was embraced. And that is why not as many people that should know about him actually know about Robert Sobukwe.
Okay. That said, so now you've provided context for that often quoted phrase of his, Africa for Africans.
Correct.
One other thing would be, why was the state so afraid of him in spite of the fact that he never advocated for violence?
Okay, because, that's a very good question. I think number one, because it would involve not only the end of apartheid, but actually the end of the South African state as it was known at that time. Because remember, it was very serious about a United States of Africa.
Yeah.
In his inaugural speech for the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1955, I believe it was. Was it 1955 or 59?
59.
Okay, 59. On April the 4th. He identified with Kwame Nkrumah. And he said every African nation should use all their energy for the creation of a United States of Africa. He said the days of small, weak countries are over. And he gave the example of the United States of America. And he gave the example of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries that were also coming together.
Okay.
He said, in order for Africans to exist in this new world and to thrive in this new world, they too needed to form a United States of Africa. So here you have somebody telling the white minority apartheid regime that not only do we plan to end racial discrimination and minority rule, but we want to make our South Africa a part of the African nation, not just the African continent. And that is extremely why he was extremely feared by the establishment.
Okay. You made mention of the Sharpeville Massacre. Can you give us a sense of what led to the massacre itself?
Well, I think that the police commanders, the white police commanders, who ultimately unleashed the killing, and to this day, the precise number is not really known.
Yeah,
seen ranging from 90 to 150 people killed. This was the first time that Africans boldly confronted the establishment. It was not one of those demonstrations where the police come and then disperse and people run, they fire tear gas, and then it's dispersed. They brought the protests to the police station at Sharpeville. Thousands of Africans showed up. And they said, we're here to be arrested because we are not carrying our passbooks with us. And under the law at that time, you're obligated to arrest them. So why were they killed? They were not really killed because they were not carrying their passport. But they were killed because they dare not run away from the system this time. The system had never been confronted like that You know, the audacity, right? The uppityness of these Africans telling you that I'm standing up
For myself.
against you. In other words, there's nothing special about you. I don't have any fear, you know, of you. And that is why I'm presenting myself to be arrested. Number one. Number two, they could not all be arrested in their thousands. And ultimately, the system had not confronted its inner, deepermost fears until that moment, confronted by Africans who are saying they're not going to run away. So I think a good reason, the main reason perhaps why they were killed, was out of fear. Because if thousands of Africans can confront you in such a manner, this is a country where the Africans make the majority of the population. What if all of them decided one day to confront you in that manner? Of course, that would have been the end of apartheid.
True, true.
And that's what they were fearing. And that's why they unleashed live bullets and just mowed down people as they fled.
Okay. Now, what was the impact of the Sharpeville Massacre on the African continent and at that time the United Nations?
Oh, of course, outrage. Outrage, but at the same time, it just tells you the value of African lives, of Black lives. Because we're talking 1960. Formal apartheid did not end until 34 years later, when Mandela was elected president of South Africa. But at the same time, it also tells you a second thing, that had they not confronted the system in such a manner, who knows, we might still be talking about apartheid, formal apartheid still existing today. Because what that did was it galvanized support which already existed on the African continent for African countries to do everything within their powers. Even these small countries, and part of course their weaknesses because they're small countries, which was the design of the colonial powers, which I would do if I were a colonial power, because it makes it easy to divide and rule. But all these countries, the ones that started winning their independence in the 1960s, because obviously when he made the speech, essentially Ghana was still the only one that had won independence in 1957. But all these countries started thinking independence, South Africa, independence, South Africa, independence, South Africa. You know, I lived in Tanzania as a teenager. Every day I read about South Africa. Every day I read the term white minority regime. I read the term illegitimate regime. I read the call for sanctions. I read about Mandela, Nelson, about winning. And I read about the ANC and the National Liberation Struggle. And much of that, of course, was sparked beginning with the apartheid, the Sharpeville Massacre. And then, of course, many more lives lost in the many years ahead. You know, we had the Soweto massacre, equal number and even exceeding of young Africans who were executed, and then the ones killed extrajudicially, like Steve Biko, who was murdered just by pounding his head with a hammer, essentially. Many were thrown out of the windows in these police cells, and supposedly they were always jumping out of the windows for some reason. For some reason. So the struggle, much more struggle was still ahead after the Sharpeville Massacre. But in addition to galvanizing on the African continent, it also galvanized globally. And it made South Africa a pariah internationally. That's when you started getting all these boycotts of South African products. South Africa eventually could not compete in Olympic Games. Just this pariah thing. And people always say, okay, you can't compete in the Olympic Games or Commonwealth. Why is that a major thing? It's a major thing because people start looking into the reasons why you're being suspended from participation in these international events and organs. And then ultimately, more people start getting involved in the global anti-apartheid struggle. Here in the United States, as you know, later on, they started having the campus protest, the divestment campaigns demanding that college campuses
divest from South Africa,
remove their resources, do not do business with companies that are dealing with apartheid Africa. So it was the major spark that started galvanizing global repudiation of apartheid. It still lasted too long, but it was an important landmark in sparking the global protest.
Okay, given that was the case, what was the I mean, okay, so I get a sense of what the African reaction was. I'm more looking at what the powers, when I mean the powers, the United States and the United Kingdom, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, on the floor of the United Nations. What was their interaction like following the Sharpeville Massacre? Because, go on.
The U.S. was the main protector of South Africa through the years. And it was because of the United States that South Africa was not expelled from the United Nations. When there were calls for the expulsion very soon, immediately rather, after that massacre. And the U.S. was already essentially shaping what later on Ronald Reagan, as you recall, famously referred to as constructive engagement. It's very interesting. Constructive engagement, you're willing to entertain that with the white racist minority regime in South Africa, but you are not preaching constructive engagement when you were talking about the Soviet Union, an actual global nuclear power with whom you have ideological differences and with whom both of you have the capability of destroying the entire world. That should have been the priority for constructive engagement. But here you are talking about the need to do that. That term was not yet in existence, but that practice was in existence. Going back way all the way to the, whether you had Eisenhower, whether you had Kennedy, and throughout that period of our engagement with South Africa. The U.S., as you know, was a major investor in the mining industry in South Africa. The U.S. At that time, I think one of the biggest banks in the world, still one of the biggest today, was Chase Bank. I think it was still called Chase Manhattan. And that was one of the major international banks in South Africa as well. So initially, after Sharpeville, the South African economy actually almost collapsed. And it had to be bailed out essentially by the United States and the United Kingdom with major infusements of investment capital. The stock market lost so much shares that had there not been that intervention, the stock market in South Africa would have collapsed, and with it the South African economy. But South Africa's mineral resources was too vital for the economy of these Western countries, including United States and the UK. And it's for that reason that, given the choice of siding with the South African people against apartheid, the choice was very easy for international capital. The choice was siding with apartheid.
So we're saying the demonization of human beings was a small price to pay in relation to profit.
Oh, absolutely. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it currently is. And we see the current manifestation right here in the United States. Think about it. Just look at the last election right here in the United States, where fear won the election from somebody who is a convicted felon, somebody who is the most unqualified to be president of the United States. But it was very simple. He had a very simple pitch. I'm keeping the barbarians at bay. I'm building a wall. I'm building a wall to protect our borders from the heathens coming across the border. And that trumped everything else. That trumped even he got the majority support of white women voters, even with his the fact that he took credit and pride for
overturning their rights.
Overturning Roe v. Wade,
yeah.
Which, of course, was very essential for women's reproductive rights. And his whole conduct toward women generally, with the multiple allegations of sexual assault and the meaning statements he has made about women. But all that did not matter when he spoke. Their truth to power. And their truth to power is that it's us against the others. And the others are the non-Europeans coming across the border. The others are the non-Europeans in South Africa. And you saw with your own eyes how they trapped us in that police headquarters. Can you imagine magnifying that by the millions of them in South Africa and in Africa generally? So it became about kith and kin. You know, it's us against them. And plus with the added advantage of capital as well and profit. So you combine this in a toxic brew, and that is why South Africa managed to hold on to apartheid for 34 more years after the Sharpeville Massacre.
Okay, so one of the questions would be, why is it that not much is really heard about Robert Sobukwe in the pantheon of South African liberation fighters? Why? I mean, his case is particular. You can count on the fingers of one hand how many people have heard that name outside of South Africa. Why is that the case?
Okay, because he was banned. After the Sharpeville, he was tried and convicted. I believe the initial sentence was for 3 years.
Yeah, correct.
But then they came up with they passed special legislation in Parliament just for him.
For him, yeah.
The Sobukwe rules. So I think it was the Minister of Internal Affairs who made the determination at the end of each year whether that special law needed to be invoked, in which case he could be detained for another year. He could be detained in perpetuity, essentially. So they passed that law. And of course, the condition for his release to him, they made it clear that all he had to do was to renounce the anti-apartheid struggle. And to him, of course, that would be like committing suicide. What would be the purpose to continue living if you renounce the anti-apartheid struggle as a condition of your release? And of course, he was not willing to do that. And he was detained for several more years after that. And then even after he was released,
It was
He was
about,
released under house arrest, and he was not allowed to be quoted. Just think about that. He was not allowed to be mentioned in any conversation. He was not allowed to be quoted. Any of his writings were not allowed to be mentioned, discussed in South
wow.
Africa. He was not allowed to meet with more than one person at a time. So, in other words, he was killed, literally. He was killed, and his memory was also killed, even though he was still alive
Hmm.
for several more years. So, that was one of the reasons why. And then he had not been able to form the kind of network that the African National Congress had formed uh, initially throughout Africa and then around the world as well. So that network, of course, is what
Yep.
ultimately made the African National Congress, the ANC, much more well known. And then, of course, the fact that Mandela, who had been incarcerated, had a person like Winnie,
Winnie.
you know,
Yeah.
Winnie Mandela, protesting his years of detention, organizing conferences, organizing protests, being seen in physical clashes with the racist police forces in South Africa, being arrested herself multiple times.
Hmm.
And also, you know how media actually works. The
Yep.
fact that Winnie was articulate and very attractive as well started getting global attention. Why do you have this woman who looks like she could be a supermodel, you know,
Just
fighting physically with these brute police forces? That always made for an interesting front page around the world. And
hmm.
ultimately, the legend of Nelson Mandela was created, and it kept growing. And that was the
Hmm.
difference between
Him and
what happened to Sobukwe and what happened with Mandela's case.
hmm. Hmm. Okay.
That's one aspect. And the other aspect, as I said
Okay.
earlier,
Hmm.
was that what he represented was much more challenging to the establishment. He was very explicit in his goals. First, the party should be led by Africans. And then in his inaugural speech in 1959 for the Pan-Africanist Congress, he also said, our uh, economic political philosophy is democratic socialist Africa. And of course, once you take that as your official position, then you're declaring liberation from capital, from
Hmm.
monopoly capital. And of
Hmm.
course, that they did not like as well.
Hmm. Okay. I know there are two books out on Sobukwe. Unfortunately, like you said, he couldn't actually put his words to paper, but books were written about him. One is for those who might want to get it. Um, Lie on Your Wounds is one that is a compilation of prison letters to and fro from um, Robert Sobukwe. The other is one written by a South African journalist at the time working for Rand Daily Mail, Benjamin Pogrund. And the title of that one is How Can Man Die Better?
Right.
That one is a bit problematic. And the reason why I say it's a bit problematic is the guy, the writer, the author of that book, Benjamin Pogrund, initially migrated to the United Kingdom. Now he's based in Jerusalem, Israel. And a couple of years ago, the idea of the Israeli state being, showing traits of apartheid was put to him, and he was vehemently against that idea. Why do you think that is the case?
What is the case?
The
That he
case,
lives in? Hmm?
no, the case that he rejected the idea of Israel being an apartheid state.
Well, I think that is a deep question, really, because I mean, I have friends
Mm,
whom I've known for years. And when it comes to the issue of Israel, I mean, I have a classmate from Columbia,
mm,
journalism,
mhm,
you know, he's Jewish. And he was explaining to me sometime in the midst of what's ongoing right now in Gaza, the massacre, the genocidal attacks against the Palestinian civilians by the Israeli air forces, women, children, elderly being the primary victims of this onslaught, this ongoing onslaught. And he explained to me, he said he has relatives that even he cannot have conversations with when it comes to the issue of Israel.
Yep.
And of course, and he explained that it goes to the connection with the whole history of the Nazi Holocaust in Germany. That has such a strong hold on the psyche that even his own relatives who under other circumstances are willing to debate any and every issue, right? But when it comes to that particular issue, concerning Israel, Israel can do no wrong. End of discussion. This is somebody that I went to journalism school with, many years ago, explaining this to me just a few months ago, explaining this to me. So maybe that factor is also playing a role in this journalist perspective. When it comes to that. And so now you see that contradiction, but he's willing to, he befriended Sobukwe.
Knowing his
because
position.
Sorry?
Knowing his position on the issue of apartheid.
Absolutely. And he lived in apartheid, South Africa, and saw what apartheid
was about
meant in South Africa. So maybe that is the similar explanation to the one that I was given by this person that I went to journalism school with.
Well, I mean, the reason I bring that up is Sobukwe was a visionary. He sort of articulates ideas in terms of how he sees Africa's place in the world. In the speech, which we would we'll pick some excerpts out of, and then we'll sort of give it a present day context, you will see similarities of what he was talking about in the 60s that now play out right now. I mean, even without going into it, there is the issue of East, West, and Africa in between, being wooed back and forth. Before we go into it, what would you deduce from then and now? Just drawing parallels and correlation.
And I go even much further than that. I go to Rodney's Crisis in the Periphery lecture, which is on YouTube. Crisis in the Periphery of the Global System, Africa and the Caribbean. And he says, for the longest time, at least since the 500 years ago, Africa was situated as a location to be exploited, right?
Yeah.
To extract labor, and that's, of course, the era of enslavement. And then when the contradictions could no longer sustain formal plantation slavery, when formal plantation slavery was now a hindrance to the expansion of capital, then you transition to colonialism, where now you have the best of all worlds. You have semi-enslaved labor, you have raw materials for your factories, and you have consumers in the terms of the population of those people, places that you colonize to be consumers. So this system was set up a very long time ago, and that aspect of that system has not changed. That's been with us 500 years and exists with us today.
Yeah. Okay.
Then, of course, you had other places in the world where capital did not take a solid grounding as it did in England. You had intellectuals visioning a different type of world. And then you had the the Russian Revolution, and you have the creation of the Soviet Union. And for a while, in addition to China, presented the prospects to many people around the world as the antidote to the global Western monopoly finance capital. So there emerged these, you could say, two hostile camps. And Africa just relinquishing formal colonial rule at the time that Sobukwe is speaking in 1959. It's become evident that following Ghana's independence in 1957, all these countries were also being lined up to start getting formal independence. So the Cold War was now being projected on Africa, transported to Africa. And he says in his speech that there's competition now from the West and the East. They're wooing us, trying to seduce us, like, you know, this beautiful lady, and everybody, both sides are contesting for Africa. So what you say is actually right, because we see that same contest being played out today by the West and what is now Russia, not the Soviet Union, as well as China.
Yes.
And the irony is that now the contest is not so much ideological, but it's over resource extraction. In the 1960s, it was different. Russia, the Soviet Union, China, at that time, were not really primarily seeking primary resources and minerals from Africa. You see, they wanted to maximize the number of friends they had. And obviously, they took the side of Africa in the liberation struggle. And they were investing on the prospects that because of supporting Africa as they were fighting European colonial rule, Africans would be much more willing to embrace them ideologically as well. And as you know, many African leaders professed non-alignment. But that was enough for them as well, because they thought non-alignment, at least you're not openly embracing the West. And once you officially embrace the West, the presumption is that you are anti the East Bloc country. And obviously, in many cases, they never had a choice. They never had a choice. You saw what happened in Congo in 1960, when the independence of Congo was hijacked, you know, practically reversed by Belgium, United States, Britain not willing to have Africans in the Congo be in control of all those resources. So they engineered a coup d'etat against Lumumba, the legitimately elected first prime minister, and they had him murdered, and they installed and sustained Mobutu for 37 years. So a lot of those dynamics still exist with us today, but more than the fact that those dynamics exist, a much more important issue is this. It is because of the weakness of these small African countries that Sobukwe refers to in this 1959 speech. Even before Nkrumah wrote Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, in 1965, 6 years later.
Or Africa must unite.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If if the United States of Africa had been created in 1963, at the first meeting of the Organization of African Unity.
African unity. Yeah.
A lot of these issues and problems and challenges that the continent faces today, we will not be discussing this today. We will be discussing other issues, but not this, you know? And I don't believe that the United States of Africa, having built its economic power from 1963 up to now, would tolerate the kind of genocidal attacks that we are seeing against the people in Gaza today. They would not just stand idly and watch, because there would be a global political and economic power, and they cannot have that kind of bloodshed going practically across the border.
True.
That is where that region is located, relative to where Egypt is located.
Yeah, Mount
so
Sinai.
just think about that.
Mount Sinai is the
So
only...
because we will fail to form a United States of Africa, we've also failed to intervene in many situations that the United States of Africa
on the continent,
would have been able to intervene in.
Yes. Saying that, let's go to the speech itself. I want to take some parts and I would like you to expand on it. So I'll go to, and the speech can be found on South African History Online. So it's titled Robert Sobukwe, the opening address at the Africanist Inaugural Convention, 4th of April, 1959. I've highlighted some parts. And so we start. International scene. This is him talking back in the day. We're living today, sons and daughters of the soil, fighters in the cause of African freedom, in an era that is pregnant with untold possibilities for good and evil. The production of so he's talking about the advancement of technology.
Right.
And he goes into, he focuses on food. So he says the production of rust-resistant strain of wheat in the field of agriculture, the amazing discoveries in the field of medicine, chemistry, physics, all this mean that man is acquiring a better knowledge of his environment and is well on the way to establishing absolute control over that environment. Now, Africa could have been in that position, just like you said, from 1963. Then he goes further. However, in spite of all of these rapid advances in material and physical world, man appears to either be unwilling to or unable to solve the problem of social relations between man and man. Could you explain what he means by that?
I don't think I need to explain anything. I think it's very obvious to anybody listening to you read that. This speech, it's 1959. This speech could be, you could change the date on it and put 2024.
Exactly.
And that is why it's so profound, you see? Absolutely. You can write a speech today. In fact, I should write a speech today.
And just change
saying, in spite of all our achievements, as a collective human family, in science, in agriculture, in technology, in medicine, you name it. At the end of the day, as he said, unable or unwilling to solve the problems, the social relations between man and
man. That is powerful.
And I submit, of course, the essential reason for that is because of greed and profit and global capital.
So I go further. We see the world split into two large hostile blocs, now free by the way, represented by the United States and the Soviet Union respectively. These blocs are engaged in terrible competition, use rough language and tactics, employ brinkmanship stunts, which have the whole world heading for a nervous breakdown. They each armed with terrible weapons of destruction and continue to spend millions of pounds in the production of more and more of these weapons. In spite of all or the diplomatic talk of coexistence, these blocs each behave as though they do not believe coexistence was possible? Again, I pose the question.
The same thing. Look at the dynamics. Look at the polarity, the polarization.
Mm,
You know, on the one hand, the same United States and her allies
mm.
in the NATO countries,
Yep, yep.
which, by the way, the attempted expansion of NATO toward Russia is the main reason for the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine.
Could you
Which,
repeat
of
that for
course,
could you repeat that for those at the back, please? That
okay, very
aspect
good.
you just said.
So yes,
Yeah.
everybody agrees that Russia rather, committed aggression by invading Ukraine.
Mm.
And this war has been ongoing, what, is it 2 years now?
Yep.
Um,
Just over.
but what is left out in the narrative was that NATO had been underhandedly expanding closer and closer to Russia by playing with the possibility of having Ukraine become a NATO partner.
member. Yeah.
And for people to understand this in a much more simple term, it would be like going back to the days of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, right?
Correct.
Of which were all these countries, satellite countries, aligned under the domination of the Soviet Union. And they had their own version of NATO, which was the Warsaw Pact, right?
Yep, yep.
Can you imagine Cuba becoming a part of the Warsaw Pact? What would the United States do?
I mean, the Cuban
The
Missile
United
Crisis.
States would probably invade Cuba. And this time would not just arm Cuban dissidents like they did at the Bay of Pigs, and they were annihilated by Castro. This time the US itself would invade Cuba. You see? So you have to contextualize these things. And that's what's going on right now between Ukraine and Russia.
But you won't get that in the media.
No, absolutely not. Because they prefer the simple narrative. There's always one bad guy. There's always one good guy. And in this case, it's our guy, Ukraine. And that justifies sending billions of dollars in finance and weapons while you ignore your own domestic issues right here in the United States.
I continue.
You know?
I continue. So we go on to the African position. The question then arises, where does Africa fit into this picture? Where particularly do we African nationalists, we Africanists in South Africa fit in? There is no doubt that with the liquidation of Western imperialism and colonialism in Asia, the capitalist market has shrunk considerably. As a result, Africa has become the happy hunting ground of aventouristic capital. There is again a scramble for Africa. Both the Soviet Union and the United Nations and the United States of America are trying to win the loyalty of the African states, which is what you alluded to earlier. He goes on and is being very facetious here when he says the courtship has reached a stage where the parties are going out together and they probably hold hands in the dark, but nowhere has it reached a stage where the parties can kiss in public without blushing. Would you say that is not the case? I mean, right now everybody's brazen about who they're with. Just take the case of the Sahel states.
Yeah, but those are exceptional. Those have taken a firm position. In many cases, they still wait, they sit on the sideline and allow both sides to sort of woo them. And that section that you just read, it's perfect fit for what is happening today. When the war started between Russia and Ukraine, you had Blinken and I forget her name now, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. How can I forget her name?
Johnson, something Johnson.
No. The current ambassador, the outgoing ambassador.
I know.
I think the last name is Greenfield?
Greenfield.
Look it up, right.
Greenfield.
So you had her and Blinken traveling to all these different African countries to try to get the leaders to align with them
Yeah.
at the United Nations in terms of, condemning Russia for the invasion. On the one hand, on the other hand, you had the um, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov also traveling to all these African countries to try to get the leaders in these countries
Yeah.
to also support them in the vote at the United Nations. So you have the same wooing that, and this time for political reasons, of course,
Yep.
that Sobukwe is discussing in his speech in 1959. And that,
The ambassador you wanted is Linda Thomas Greenfield.
yes, correct, Greenfield, Linda Thomas Greenfield. So, but then it goes back to what I just said earlier. Why is this happening? This is happening because Africa remains potentially very strong, but effectively very weak. Potentially very strong because it has the number, the population.
Yep.
1.3 billion people. Imagine united under one flag, the United States of Africa. Can you imagine? Automatic power right there. Right? And then the resources that the continent has. One of the most desirable resource right now is cobalt in the era of clean energy for electric cars, right?
Yep.
You need it to make those batteries. Congo, between Congo and Zambia, they probably have close to 70%
of the world's world's reserve. Yep.
But they cannot leverage that as these two tiny countries. Whatever they get in return will be acceptable to the West or even to China, you see, which is now a global economic power as well.
True.
So it goes back to the same thing, the same reason why Sobukwe formed the Pan-Africanist Congress. Sobukwe would have been happy to serve under a President Kwame Nkrumah if there was a United States of
Africa.
You know, we need those type of committed Pan-Africanist leaders. And there were a few in the 1960s, but now we're not producing them because many Africans see what happened to those leaders in the 1960s, and they're not willing to pay the ultimate price, which is with their life,
Well, I'll continue. We're being wooed internationally at a time when in South Africa, the naked forces of savage Herecovonism are running riot, when a determined effort is being made to annihilate the African people through systematic starvation, at a time when brutal attempts are being made to retard, dwarf, and stunt the mental development of a whole people through organized miseducation, at a time when thousands of our people roam the streets in search of work and are being told by the foreign ruler to go back to a home which he has assigned them, whether that meant the breakup of their families or not, at a time when the distinctive badge of slavery and humiliation, the dumb pass, is being extended from the African male dog to the African female bitch.
All right, so Sobukwe was a very smart, intelligent man. And I'm wondering, right?
Good.
And I think, now Benjamin, what's his last name again? The journalist.
Pogrund.
In their interactions, I wish I'd asked him, how do you see South Africa eventually being liberated? Do you think it's going to be internal uprising that the state will not be able to contain? something similar to Sharpeville, but multiplied all over the country?
Mm.
Do you think it's going to take armed intervention from the other African nations as they win their independence and become stronger?
Hmm.
What do you think is going to happen? How do you think apartheid will ultimately end? And of course, it took armed military intervention,
Sure.
but it was not by the neighboring African states, as you know.
Yep.
It took armed military intervention from Cuba.
Tiny Cuba.
Cuba intervened in 1975 to ensure that UNITA and the FNLA, UNITA led by Savimbi, FNLA led by Olden Roberto, both CIA agents,
Yep.
would not end up being in power in Angola after these separate liberation movements, in addition to the MPLA under Agostinho Neto, had defeated the Portuguese militarily in Angola during the liberation struggle. So now come to an independence, I believe November 1975.
Yep.
Cuba decisively intervenes on the side of the MPLA, which is led by, as I said, by Agostinho Neto, who was a socialist or believed in Marxist-Leninist principles. So they were ideological compatriots, and they won. And Neto became president. And then you have in 1987, when South Africa invaded massively in support of Savimbi and UNITA, and they might have gone all the way to take power in Angola. So for a second time, Cuba intervened massively with tens of thousands of soldiers, and Castro himself commanding the battle by satellite phone. And they defeated South Africa militarily, and they were forced to withdraw. And when they withdrew, they realized that this is a slippery slope. Those guys could actually pursue us back to South Africa and defeat us. So they allowed, and let's also remember, as the Cubans fought alongside Angola's National Army and the ANC's Umkhonto we Sizwe, which was the armed guerrilla wing, as well as SWAPO, which was the Liberation Army of Namibia. So Namibia becomes independent. Mandela is released. Mandela becomes president. I don't think in his most fertile vision
they could envisage such a thing.
That Sobukwe could have, foreseen something like this, because he would analyze the powers and he would say, well, I don't see the Soviet Union really becoming militarily involved to help us end apartheid, because that will probably spark conflict between the Soviet Union and the NATO countries, right?
True,
so it's after World War. I don't see China doing the same thing, right? And who could imagine tiny Cuba, because of how the government and society was organized in Cuba, being able to have that ideological component to be willing for that kind of intervention, and set South Africa to its course, which of course takes us to the next conversation. And that is for another conversation, because
God.
what does independence really mean in Africa, correct? What does the end of apartheid really mean in South Africa if all the economic structures of domination are still in place? In Africa as well as in South Africa. But that would take a whole program in itself.
Okay, one final piece.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So he says, the African leaders of the continent has given her answer. Mr. Speaker and children of the soil, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, has repeatedly stated that in international affairs, Africa wishes to pursue a policy of positive neutrality, aligning ourselves to neither the existing blocs, but in the words of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, remaining independent in all things but neutral in none. But that affects the destiny of Africa. Mr. Tom Mboya of Kenya has expressed himself more forthrightly, declaring it is not the intention of African states to change one master Western imperialism for another Soviet hegemony. Wow, that
All right.
is.
So that is, and obviously, what he could not have done at that time was to assess and analyze how reactionary and disappointing the African bourgeoisie, the new emerging class in Africa, how reactionary and how destructive they were going to be to the interest of Africa, which is exactly what happened. So at the end of the day, they actually ended up being either aligned with the West or aligned with the East. Because to be not aligned, first of all, you have to be strong. You have to be power. You can't say,
I'm just non-aligned.
I don't want to get involved in your arguments, therefore I'm not aligned. They'll say, okay, you still want that money? What do you think this is? He was using the analogy of being, wooing a beautiful lady. You're saying we go out on a date, right? And I handle the tab and you just turn and walk home. Every time we go on a date, 2 dates, 3 dates, 4 dates, 5 dates, 10 dates, you are not advancing our relationship any further. Does the world really work like that? You see? Jerry Rawlings actually put it best. The late Ghanaian president. He said, we did not even have a chance to be African. We were not given an opportunity to be African. We were told we had no choice. You have to be either pro-West or pro-East. Jerry Rawlings said this.
And Sankara went a step further by saying, I cannot do it alone. If I did, I will not be here for the next meeting. But if they can kill they can kill us all. Yes. I mean, it's like those guys really study their history, which is what is often lacking nowadays. Is that idea that
Sankara easily could have been a university professor.
Yeah.
He loved reading, he loved knowledge, and he was very well read. With other journalists, he would discuss the books that he had bought, books he had read. That should be a requirement for any and every African head of state. You cannot lead a whole country if you're anti-knowledge, I wonder what Nyerere would say about the current United States president. Because Nyerere said, and I've repeated this many times, I think it was in 1985, maybe after he had just stepped down as president, or maybe before, maybe he was still president of Tanzania. He said that he told an American journalist, the world and the United States would be a much better place if the United States had an opposition party. And the journalist said, what do you mean, Mr. President? We have the Democrats and Republicans. He said, that's the problem. Both imperialist and both capitalist. And now, if he were to be told today that the current president does not even like reading, Nyerere would say, okay, guys, I've had enough of my existence in this world. It's time for me to go. Join me with the ancestors at some point. Right? Nyerere, who was a teacher before he went into politics.
Yeah, Walimu.
Right? Whose most prized possession was not automobiles or mansion, but books.
Books
that he had.
Yeah.
Thousands of books. I think I was watching one program where I think it was said 10,000 books, and I read all of those books. And now you're telling him that the current United States president does not like reading. When he's telling you that the whole world is impacted by the United States. Think about that.
Oh, we have a
So,
question.
sisters and brothers, we have our work cut out. But that is the beauty also of being born and located in Africa, because we started human existence. It is from Africa where it started and then spread around the world, right? It means the solution for the continuation of human existence will have to come from Africa as
Yep.
well, from where it really started.
Mm.
And that's one advantage we have. Many Africans, we are still connected to our humanity and our spirituality, no matter how much capital and modernization has corrupted a lot of that. You know, as people, I think we are still most closely connected to the essence of the earth itself. And that is what is really needed. You know, we can't become, you know, human technocrats or robots, you know. You know,
I
that's
mean,
why, you know, many people from all over the world still go to Africa to see nature as nature should exist, you know, to see game and wild animal and scenic locations that have not yet been ruined by modern development. So Africa will continue to play a significant role in reconstructing the world that we deserve. We just need better leadership in Africa. We need more
and
people like the Robert Sobukwe in Africa.
and speaking to the solution coming from Africa, check out the job actually put forth a
Yes,
documented solution in
thank you. Mention
1974.
that book, please. Remind people of that book.
It's called Black Africa: The Economic and
I'm trying to look for
Cultural
mine. I think
Basis
it's somewhere up there.
for a Federated State. And the book was published in 1974. So the the solution is not exactly there. You go. There you go. That's it. The solution is at hand. These things, like you said, if one leader who is forthright enough is able to read and even goes in depth, okay, if you cannot read an entire book, it actually goes into 14
Yeah,
steps.
I think
14
we
steps.
should put that in one of our next discussions. The book,
14,
since we both have copies, you know.
yeah, 14
Yeah.
steps. It goes in detail into what is needed, how it
Yep.
should be done, when it should be done. You know, so you find all these leaders going around, coming to Europe for
Looking
problems
for
that
solutions when the solution
exactly
has already been, you know, outlined for them.
from them, step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 14.
Yeah.
You know, again, I know we can go on and on, but again,
We will save some for next week.
again, thank you. We've come to the end of another hopefully exciting conversation for everyone. And again, like I said, thank you all for subscribing to the channel. If this is your first time, yeah, you can still subscribe. 1,000 is not the limit. 1,000 just means this. We're telling YouTube that this is what people want to see, and the more people subscribe to it, the more YouTube puts it in front of viewers, and hopefully everybody comes to terms with the information we're passing on here and sharing. And again, I'd like to say thank you, not just to Comrade Milton, also to our audience and those who will listen to this in the course of the week on the audio podcast. Continue to subscribe, share, you know, all the good stuff. Each one bring one, as they say. And
Yeah.
Brother Milton, thank you very much for coming through. And
Very
from me, it's good night and see you all next week. And bye-bye. Okay. Okay. think we're good. Yeah.
So you're still recording, huh?
Yeah, I just said refresh page. What do you mean refresh? Cancel? Something went wrong, but don't worry
Oh,
about it.
no, don't tell us.
No, hopefully not. Hopefully not. Everyone is still being recorded. Please try to refresh to resolve the issue. 1 second. Let me just do this.
Okay, but I shouldn't do anything on my end, right?
Yeah, don't do anything yet. Just
Are you still there? Okay.
yeah, I'm still here. I'm still here. Okay, so stop that. And yeah. Yeah, it's done. It's done.
Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, so let me run and have some lunch.
Okay, thank you very much for coming through. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care,
Okay.
brother.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.